The morning sun cast a weak glow through the curtains as Riva stood by the kitchen counter, her hands clenched around a steaming cup of tea. Across the room, Jester slouched on the couch, his unkempt hair falling over his bloodshot eyes. "Can you leave me some money today?" he grunted, not bothering to meet her gaze. Riva sighed, her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "Jester, I gave you money 2 days ago. I know where it went." "You're always nagging," he muttered, brushing her words aside. "Just give me some cash. It's not like you're struggling." Riva's jaw tightened. Without another word, she grabbed her bag and stormed out the door, ignoring his protests. Her chest ached as she walked to the car, but she forced herself to focus. The new session was starting at the college, and her students deserved her full attention. The classroom buzzed with the chatter of new faces. Riva entered with her usual air of quiet authority, her fitted blazer and pencil skirt adding to her commanding presence. As she placed her books on the desk, the students fell silent. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady. "I'm Professor Riva, and I'll be teaching you this semester. Let's start with introductions." The students took turns standing up. Some were confident, others nervous, but one stood out. Avon. "I'm Avon," he said, his tone bordering on arrogance. "I've always been passionate about academics, and, well, I like to challenge myself. I believe that's the best way to grow." His words carried an undertone that Riva didn't miss. He was already sizing her up. She acknowledged him with a nod and moved on, but the flicker of a smirk on his lips lingered in her mind. Later, Riva sat in her office with a salad container in hand when Cooper, a fellow professor, knocked on the open door. "Lunch alone again?" he asked with a warm smile. Riva looked up, slightly startled. "Oh, Cooper, come in, I was just—" "How about some company?" he offered, setting his tray down. She hesitated, but then smiled. "Sure." Their conversation was light, mostly about work. For a brief moment, Riva felt a reprieve from the tension at home. The next day, the classroom felt different. Avon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a cocky grin tugging at his lips. Riva was midway through explaining a complex concept when Avon raised his hand. "Yes, Avon." "I think that's an oversimplification," he said, his tone challenging. "Wouldn't it make more sense to approach it this way?" He launched into a convoluted explanation, clearly aiming to outshine her. Some students glanced nervously at Riva, while others seemed entertained. Riva held her ground. "An interesting perspective, Avon, but that approach overlooks a key principle. Let me explain why." Her voice was calm but firm, and her counterpoint was flawless. However, Avon refused to back down. "You're not seeing the bigger picture," he argued. Riva's patience waned. "Avon, this isn't a debate club. I appreciate curiosity, but disrupting the class to prove yourself isn't productive. Please focus on learning rather than showing off." The class fell silent. Avon's smirk disappeared, replaced by a flicker of anger. Without a word, he grabbed his bag and left the room, slamming the door behind him. During lunch, Riva spotted Avon in the courtyard, shoving another student. The smaller boy, Jack, looked terrified. "Avon!" Riva called sharply, marching over. "What's going on here?" Avon stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Nothing, Professor. Just sorting something out." "This isn't how you sort things out," she snapped. "You're a college student, not a street thug. Behave yourself, or there will be consequences." Avon said nothing, but his clenched fists spoke volumes. Later that afternoon, Jack approached Riva hesitantly. "Professor?" "Yes, Jack?" I just wanted to tell you that Avon bullies a lot of us, he said quietly. He always humiliates me in class, and he picks on others too. Riva's heart sank. Thank you for telling me. I'll handle it. Jack nodded, relief evident in his eyes. As the day ended, Riva packed her things and left the building. The air was cool, and the sun dipped low on the horizon. She noticed someone following her and glanced over her shoulder. It was Avon. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding. He didn't try to speak, just trailed behind her, his presence unnerving. Riva clenched her jaw and walked faster, refusing to let him intimidate her. When she reached her car, she glanced back one last time. Avon was gone. For now. Riva's morning had been calm, a welcome reprieve from the stormy undercurrent of her personal life and the challenges of teaching. But as the lunch break approached, the familiar knock on her office door stirred an uneasy feeling. Riva, Cooper greeted, stepping in with a warm, confident smile. Lunch together again? Riva hesitated, fiddling with the pen in her hand. I'm sorry, Cooper, but I have a lot of work to catch up on today. His expression faltered slightly before he quickly masked it with a polite nod. Of course, maybe another time. She watched him leave, feeling a twinge of guilt. He had been nothing but kind so far, but her instincts told her to keep her distance. That evening, as Riva packed her bag and stepped out of her office, she found Cooper waiting near the parking lot. Riva, he called, walking up to her. It's getting late. Let me give you a ride home. She paused, weighing the offer. Her car was still at the mechanic's, and a bus ride at this hour didn't seem appealing. All right, she said finally. As they drove, the car's interior was quiet save for the hum of the engine. Cooper, however, broke the silence. You know, I admire how dedicated you are to your work, he began. It can't be easy, managing everything. Riva gave a polite smile. It has its challenges, but I love teaching. He nodded, then hesitated before his next question. What about at home? Is everything okay? Riva stiffened, sensing where this was heading. I manage, she replied curtly. You deserve better, Cooper said, his voice softening. A woman like you. Strong, intelligent, beautiful. If I were your husband... Cooper, please, Riva interrupted, turning to him sharply. But he pressed on, leaning closer. You're amazing, Riva. Before she could react, he tried to kiss her. Riva pulled back instantly, her hand on the car door. Stop the car. Riva, Stop the car, she repeated firmly. He slowed to a halt, and she stepped out, slamming the door behind her. Without looking back, she walked the rest of the way home, her heart pounding with anger and unease. The next morning, Riva entered her classroom, determined to focus on her students. As she began her lecture, she noticed Jack at the back of the room, his eyes wandering. Jack, she said, walking toward him. Pay attention. This is important. Jack looked down, embarrassed. But before he could respond, Avon's voice cut through the room. Why bother, Professor? Jack's a lost cause. He's dumb, and everyone knows it. The class fell silent, all eyes darting between Avon and Riva. Riva's face hardened. Avon, leave the class, now. Avon smirked, as if daring her to back down, but when she stood firm, he grabbed his bag and walked out, muttering under his breath. Riva took a deep breath, then turned back to the class. Let's continue. After college, Riva caught Jack as he was leaving. Jack, she called, her voice gentle. He turned hesitantly. Yes, Professor? Walk with me, she said. As they strolled across the campus, Riva spoke carefully. "Jack, I know things haven't been easy for you in class, but I believe you have potential. You just need to focus and believe in yourself." Jack looked at her, surprised. "You really think I can do better?" "I don't think—" "I know," Riva said firmly. "If you care about your future, you'll put in the effort, and I'll be here to help you." Their conversation lasted nearly an hour, with Jack opening up about his struggles and fears. For the first time, he felt that someone truly cared about him. Over the next few weeks, Riva noticed a remarkable change in Jack. He began sitting at the front of the class, taking notes diligently. He stayed after school to discuss his progress with Riva, who offered guidance and encouragement. But Avon, watching from a distance, seethed with resentment. Jack's transformation irritated him. The quiet student he used to ridicule was now gaining the professor's attention, something Avon couldn't stand. One afternoon, as Riva was leaving, Jack approached her with a bright smile. "Professor, thank you for everything. I'm actually starting to enjoy studying." "That's the spirit," Riva said warmly. "Keep it up." Avon, standing nearby, glared at the scene. His fists clenched as he watched Jack walk away, a sense of unease simmering in the air. Riva didn't notice Avon's stare as she headed to her car, but she could feel something shifting. A storm was brewing, and she had no idea how close it truly was. Riva stood at the front of her classroom, her voice calm yet firm as she wrote equations on the board. Her determination to uplift every student resonated in her teachings. She glanced at Jack, who was sitting at the front row, scribbling down notes with a focus that she hadn't seen before. A soft smile tugged at her lips. Jack was proving everyone wrong, and she couldn't be prouder. At the back of the room, however, Avon sat slouched in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes glaring at Riva. Over the past few weeks, his behavior had worsened. He often disrupted class, muttered under his breath, and made sharp comments that alienated him from his peers. Riva had tried everything: patience, stern reprimands, and even private discussions, but nothing seemed to reach him. Avon was slipping further into his bitterness, and the rest of the class had begun to avoid him altogether. When the results were announced, Riva stood with a stack of grade sheets in hand, her expression a mixture of pride and anticipation. "Congratulations to Jack," she said, her voice warm. "You're the class topper." The room erupted in applause, and Jack's face turned bright red. He looked down shyly, mumbling a quiet, "Thank you." But in the corner of the room, Avon's eyes darkened. His jaw tightened as he stared at his own result. Good, but not the best. Not anymore. As the class celebrated Jack's achievement, Avon shoved his chair back noisily and walked out. It was Teacher's Day, a festive atmosphere buzzing across the college. Students came to class with cards, flowers, and gifts, their smiles wide and sincere. Riva was showered with affection, handwritten notes, chocolates, and even a beautifully wrapped book from a student who knew she loved reading. When Jack approached her with a vibrant bouquet of flowers, he shyly said, "Thank you for believing in me, Professor. These are for you." Riva accepted them with a warm smile. "Thank you, Jack. Keep working hard." She noticed, however, that Avon was standing near the back of the classroom, empty-handed. When the celebrations ended, she caught him by the door as the students filed out. "Avon," she called softly. "Can we talk for a moment?" He turned slowly, his face unreadable. Riva hesitated, searching for the right words. "You hate me, don't you?" Avon's lips twisted into a bitter smirk. "Yes, ma'am. I do." The directness of his answer stung, but Riva remained composed. "Why?" "You're responsible for my failure," Avon said. his voice sharp with accusation. Riva frowned, confused. What kind of failure are you talking about? Avon stepped closer, his eyes blazing. You know exactly what I mean. Jack's the topper now because of you. You taught him better than the rest of us, better than me. And now look at me. I've fallen behind. You made me worse. Riva took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. Avon, I've never favored one student over another. My goal has always been to help everyone achieve their best. Jack's success isn't about me. It's about him choosing to work hard and focus. Liar! Avon spat, his fists clenched. You pushed me aside. Riva's voice softened. I didn't push you aside, Avon. You allowed distractions to take over. You're intelligent, but your jealousy and anger are holding you back. If you concentrate on your studies again, you'll see that you can reach the top just like before. Avon's face hardened, his jaw set in defiance. I don't believe you. Before Riva could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, frustrated and helpless. From behind, Jack approached cautiously. Professor, I saw what happened. Riva turned to him, her shoulders slumping slightly. It's not his fault, Jack. He's struggling, and he doesn't know how to handle it. Jack frowned. But it's not your fault either. Avon needs to take responsibility for himself. He's the one who let jealousy get in the way. Riva sighed, offering a faint smile. You're all good students, Jack. Sometimes it just takes time for people to realize it. After college, as Riva walked toward the parking lot, she saw Cooper leaning against his car. He waved her over, his smile as confident as ever. Need a ride, Riva? He asked. She didn't respond, simply walking past him without a word. Cooper's smile faltered, and his eyes narrowed as he watched her disappear into the crowd. The streets were bustling with evening traffic, and Riva grew impatient. She decided to take a shortcut through the wooded area near her route home, a path she had walked before in daylight. But as the shadows deepened, an uneasy feeling crept over her. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound being the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled from the darkness ahead. Riva froze, her breath hitching. Emerging from the shadows was a massive wolf, its yellow eyes glowing like fire, its teeth bared in a menacing snarl. She screamed and turned, running as fast as her legs could carry her. The wolf gave chase, its heavy paws thundering behind her. Help! She yelled, her voice breaking with panic. The edge of the forest and the faint glow of the road lights came into view, but the wolf lunged. Riva felt a searing pain across her back as its claws grazed her. Stumbling forward, she managed to reach the road, gasping for breath. A cab screeched to a halt, and Riva climbed in, trembling. Drive, she whispered, clutching her side. The driver looked alarmed but didn't ask questions. As the cab sped away, Riva glanced back at the forest, her heart hammering in her chest. The wolf was gone, but the fear lingered. When she arrived home, she locked the door and collapsed onto the couch. Her back throbbed, but it wasn't the pain that unnerved her. It was the haunting image of those glowing eyes. Something wasn't right, and she knew this was only the beginning. Riva stirred her coffee in silence, watching the pale sunlight filter through the curtains. Her back still ached from the scratch, and the memory of the wolf's glowing eyes gnawed at her thoughts. She had decided to skip work, hoping a day of rest would ease her tension. The quiet day passed uneventfully until she decided to step into her small garden for fresh air. She opened the door and froze. At the edge of the lawn, near the trees, stood the wolf. Its piercing yellow eyes locked onto hers, unblinking and intense. Riva's breath caught, a cold sweat forming on her brow. This wasn't a random animal. It felt deliberate, as if it had returned for a purpose. Without waiting another second, she slammed the door shut and locked it. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone and called the police. "A giant wolf," she said, trying to steady her voice. "It attacked me 2 days ago, and now it's outside my house." The officers arrived within minutes, armed and alert. They searched the area thoroughly but found no trace of the creature. "Wolves don't usually venture this close to town," one officer said. "We'll extend our search into the forest, but keep your doors locked and stay alert." Riva nodded, still uneasy. The officers left, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after. The next day, she returned to college, still shaken but determined to carry on. In class, Jack noticed her pale complexion and approached her during a break. "Professor," he said hesitantly, "are you okay? You don't look... well." Riva considered brushing it off, but decided otherwise. "A wolf attacked me 2 nights ago," she admitted, her voice low. "And yesterday, I saw the same wolf standing outside my house, just watching me." Jack's eyes widened. "That's terrible. Did you report it?" "Yes, but it disappeared before the police arrived. The strange thing is, it didn't feel like an ordinary wolf. It was almost as if it was trying to warn me about something." Jack frowned, clearly unsettled. "You shouldn't take shortcuts through the forest anymore. It's not safe." Riva managed a faint smile. "I won't. I've learned my lesson." At lunch, Riva braced herself for another encounter with Cooper. His relentless attempts to impress her had become a daily annoyance, and she'd made up her mind. If he bothered her again, she would report him to the head. To her surprise, Cooper didn't approach her at all. Instead, he sat at the far end of the staff lounge, absorbed in conversation with another professor. Riva couldn't help but feel relieved. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to relax, eating her lunch without interruption. After classes, as the campus began to empty, Avon approached her. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was firm. "Professor Riva, I want you to give me extra lessons. I need to be the topper again." Riva set her bag down, her exhaustion evident. "Avon, I teach everyone equally. If you focus and put in the effort, you'll do well again." Avon's jaw tightened. "That's not good enough. You gave Jack special attention, and look where it got him. I deserve the same." "I didn't give Jack special attention," Riva replied patiently. "He sought help, and I encouraged him. That's what I do for any student who asks. But I won't play favorites, Avon." His eyes narrowed, his frustration palpable. Without another word, he turned and stormed off, leaving Riva alone in the corridor. The cab ride home was quiet, but unease crept in as Riva approached her house. She opened the door to find Jester slouched on the couch, a bottle of liquor in his hand. "Where's the money?" he slurred, his eyes bloodshot. "I don't have any," Riva replied firmly, setting her bag down. "I gave you money yesterday. That was all I could spare." Jester's face darkened. "Don't lie to me, Riva. You're holding out." "I'm not," she said, her voice steady but edged with anger. Jester stood abruptly, his movements unsteady. "You think you're better than me?" he spat. "I'll show you what happens when you disrespect me." He lunged toward her, but Riva was faster. She stepped aside and, without hesitation, punched him square in the face. Jester staggered backward, clutching his nose, stunned. Before he could recover, Riva grabbed her coat and bolted out the door. She didn't stop running until she reached the nearby main street. The warm light of a small restaurant beckoned, and Riva stepped inside, her hands still trembling. She ordered a simple meal and sat by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. As she ate, Her thoughts swirled. Cooper's strange behavior, Avon's growing hostility, Jester's violence, and the wolf that seemed more than just an animal. Everything felt tangled, like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. Riva took a deep breath and resolved to stay strong. Whatever was happening, she would face it. But as she left the restaurant and walked back toward her temporary refuge, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. The cool night air wrapped around Riva as she stepped out of the restaurant. Her coat did little to fend off the chill creeping into her bones, but her mind was preoccupied with more pressing concerns. She walked aimlessly down the dimly lit streets, unsure of where to go. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on her. Each step echoed in the silence until she reached a road that bordered the forest. There, under the faint moonlight, she saw it again. The wolf. It stood still, half hidden among the trees, its yellow eyes piercing through the darkness. Riva's breath caught, her legs stiffening as fear gripped her. The wolf stared, unflinching, as though waiting for her to make the first move. Her instincts screamed at her to run, and she did. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she rushed toward her home. The streets blurred in her peripheral vision, her focus fixed on putting distance between herself and the menacing creature. When she reached her house, she paused, her heart racing. She hesitated at the gate, peering through the windows to check if Jester was still inside. The house was dark and silent. He was gone. Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. As she moved toward the front door, she sensed it again. She turned slowly and saw the wolf standing near her fence, illuminated by the glow of a street lamp. Riva froze, the weight of its gaze pressing down on her. It wasn't just an animal. It felt purposeful, almost human. She forced herself to move, unlocking the door with trembling hands. Once inside, she bolted the door and leaned against it, her breath shallow. Gathering courage, she opened a window slightly to peer outside. The wolf had vanished. The night was still, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was out there, watching. The next morning, Riva arrived at the college, determined to push the unsettling events aside and focus on her students. As she entered the classroom, she noticed something unexpected. Avon. He was smiling, greeting his classmates, and even helping a fellow student organize their notes. Riva paused, watching in disbelief. Avon's usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a calm, almost friendly presence. Throughout the day, Avon's transformation became the talk of the college. His tone was respectful, his attitude cooperative, and his actions considerate. He volunteered to help during group discussions and stayed back to tutor students who struggled. By the time classes ended, everyone seemed to admire Avon's newfound positivity. Riva, too, was surprised but wary. She couldn't ignore the drastic shift in his behavior, especially after his anger and jealousy had been so evident. As the students filed out, Riva caught up with Avon in the corridor. "Avon!" she called out, her voice steady. He turned, his face neutral. "Yes, Professor?" "You're doing good," she said, her tone cautious. Avon's expression didn't change, but his response was sharp. "You're the worst teacher I've ever had. I wish I could remove you from this college." Riva blinked, taken aback. "But you've changed, haven't you? You're helping others, making friends. Why do you still feel this way about me?" Avon's eyes darkened, his voice low and biting. "Yes, I've changed. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten how you treated me. You ignored me when I needed your help. You turned me into a laughingstock." "That's not true," Riva said, her voice firm but calm. "I've never ignored you. I've always wanted every student to succeed, including you. If you felt neglected, that was never my intention." Avon smirked bitterly. "Intentions don't matter, Professor. Actions do. And your actions ruined me." Riva looked at him, searching for the right words. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry you feel that way, but holding on to anger won't help you. The person you're becoming now, that's someone you can be proud of. Don't let hatred pull you back." Avon's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it. "I don't need your advice," he muttered, before turning and walking away. Riva stood there, watching him go, a mix of sadness and frustration swirling within her. For all his apparent changes, Avon was still battling something deeper, something he refused to confront. The day dragged on, but Riva couldn't shake the conversation with Avon from her mind. When classes ended, she felt a familiar unease as she prepared to leave the campus. She opted for a cab again, unwilling to risk walking alone. The ride home was uneventful, but as the car approached her neighborhood, she scanned the shadows for any sign of the wolf. When she arrived, the house was empty. Jester hadn't returned. Riva locked the door behind her and sat in silence, her thoughts racing. Avon's words, the wolf's relentless presence, and Jester's violent outbursts, all of it weighed heavily on her. She had a growing sense that these events were connected. But how? And why? Riva didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain. Whatever was happening wasn't over, and she wasn't sure she could face it alone. The evening had settled into a quiet stillness as Riva walked home, her heels brushing against the gravel road. The forest loomed to her right, its darkened edges fading into the encroaching night. She couldn't shake the unease that clung to her like a second skin, an instinctual warning she couldn't explain. Her pace quickened until movement near the bushes halted her steps. A rustling sound, sharp and deliberate, made her grip her bag tighter. She squinted, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing beyond the dense underbrush. Turning back to the road, she resolved to ignore it. Yet as she walked, a voice drifted toward her, faint but familiar. She froze, the sound tugging at her memory. Who could it be? Curious but cautious, she ducked behind a cement bench a few paces ahead. Keeping her breathing steady, she waited. The minutes dragged, and then a figure emerged from the forest, stepping into the faint glow of the street lamp. Avon. Riva's eyes widened as she took in his disheveled appearance. His shirt hung in shreds, exposing scratches across his arms. Mud caked his jeans, and his mouth glistened with a dark, unmistakable smear. Blood. She pressed herself further into the shadows, her pulse quickening as he walked past, his steps unhurried. There was something primal about the way he carried himself, like a predator retreating after a hunt. When he disappeared down the road, Riva let out a shaky breath. But her curiosity burned, outweighing the fear that told her to go home. Against her better judgment, she stepped off the path and into the trees, tracing Avon's path back toward the forest. The scent of earth and decay hit her as she ventured deeper, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. A few feet in, she stopped abruptly. On the ground lay a large mouse, its body torn and mangled. Blood stained the dirt around it, and its flesh was shredded, as though ripped apart by sharp teeth. Half its meat was gone, leaving exposed bone. Riva clamped a hand over her mouth, the sight turning her stomach. Avon had done this. But how? And why? Unable to face the questions swirling in her mind, she turned and hurried home. The following day at college, Riva couldn't keep her eyes off Avon. From the moment he walked into class, she tracked his every movement. There was something unnerving about his calm demeanor, the way he seemed untouched by the chaos he had left in the forest. When lunch arrived, she decided to test her theory. She retrieved a small blade from her bag and discreetly grazed her palm. The sting was sharp, and a bead of crimson welled up immediately. "Oh!" she exclaimed, loud enough to draw attention. A few students turned to look, but it was Avon's reaction that caught her breath. His head snapped up, and his eyes zeroed in on her hand with a startling intensity. His jaw tightened, and his fingers curled into fists as though he were holding himself back. A flicker of something animalistic crossed his face before he turned away abruptly, muttering an excuse and leaving the room. Riva quickly bandaged her hand, her suspicion now a certainty. Avon was not normal. After college, she decided to follow him again, careful to keep her distance. Avon walked home without incident, disappearing inside his modest house. Riva waited until nightfall before returning, parking a few streets away and approaching on foot. She settled in the shadows, her eyes trained on the house. Hours passed, and then the door opened. Avon stepped out, glancing around before heading toward the forest. Riva followed, her nerves fraying with every step. The forest was even darker at night, the trees forming an oppressive canopy overhead. Riva kept her flashlight off, relying on the faint moonlight to guide her. Avon moved with purpose, deeper into the woods until he reached a small clearing. Riva hid behind a thick oak tree, pulling out her phone and hitting record. At first, Avon stood still, his breathing deep and steady. Then his body convulsed. He dropped to his knees, gripping the ground as a low, guttural growl escaped his lips. Riva's grip tightened on her phone as she watched, her eyes wide. Avon's hands twisted unnaturally, his fingers elongating into claws that tore into the dirt. His back arched, his muscles bulging and contorting beneath his skin. The sound of bones snapping filled the air, each crack like a gunshot in the stillness. His jaw extended, his teeth lengthening into razor-sharp fangs. Dark fur erupted across his body, spreading like wildfire. When Avon lifted his head, it was no longer human. Glowing amber eyes pierced the darkness, set into a wolfish face that exuded raw power. Riva's phone trembled in her hands as she continued recording, unable to tear her eyes away. The beast rose to its full height, towering and menacing, its breaths visible in the cool night air. The werewolf sniffed the wind before darting into the underbrush. Riva crept closer, keeping her distance but following its movements. In a flash, the werewolf pounced on a rabbit. The animal squealed briefly before being silenced. Riva watched, horrified, as the werewolf tore into its prey, devouring it with savage efficiency. Blood stained its muzzle, and pieces of flesh hung from its jaws. Riva's stomach churned, but she kept filming, knowing she had to document everything. Then the werewolf stopped. It straightened, its ears swiveling toward her hiding spot. The amber eyes locked onto her position, narrowing. Riva's breath hitched, and she realized her mistake. She had shifted, and the sound had given her away. Without thinking, she stuffed her phone into her pocket and bolted. The forest seemed to close in around her as she ran, branches clawing at her clothes and face. Behind her, the werewolf's growl rumbled, a predatory sound that sent her scrambling faster. She burst through the tree line and onto the road, her legs threatening to give out. A passing car slowed as she waved it down, barely managing to explain that she needed a ride. Once home, Riva locked her doors and windows, her hands trembling as she retrieved her phone. The video was there, every horrifying moment captured in vivid detail. Avon's transformation, the hunt, the raw violence. It was undeniable proof. Riva stared at the screen, her mind racing. She now knew the truth. Avon was the werewolf. Riva sat at her desk, the cold light of the morning sun filtering through her window, but her mind was a storm. The video had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She couldn't erase the image of Avon's transformation from her mind, the raw power in his beastly form, the way he hunted with brutal efficiency. It was clear now. Avon was the one who had been stalking her, trying to hurt her. But what was she supposed to do about it? She had called the police the night before. At first, her hands had trembled as she reported the strange occurrences and the unsettling creature near the forest. She hadn't mentioned the video, though. It was too much, too unbelievable. The police had promised to look into it, but Riva wasn't sure they would even take her seriously. How could they? Who would believe that a student from her college could be a werewolf? That same confusion lingered in her chest as she arrived at the college the next day. Her gaze instinctively sought out Avon, but it wasn't him she noticed first. It was Jack. He was talking to Avon, his back turned to Riva. She couldn't hear their conversation, but the sight of them together made something stir inside her. When she walked closer, both Jack and Avon froze. Avon, without a word, turned and walked away briskly, his footsteps echoing in the hall. "Everything okay?" Riva asked Jack as she approached. Jack nodded, his usual easygoing smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, everything's fine. I've just been trying to talk to Avon lately. You know, trying to be a good friend. We've had our differences, but I think it's time to let the past go." Riva felt a strange relief at his words. She had always hoped for reconciliation between the two, and hearing Jack's intent to rebuild their friendship lifted some of the weight she had been carrying. But Jack's face shifted, becoming serious, his eyes flickering toward where Avon had just walked off. "There's something you should know, though." Riva raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Jack hesitated, glancing around as if ensuring no one else was listening. "Last night," he began, his voice low, "I saw something. Something terrifying. It was near the forest around midnight. A werewolf." Riva's blood ran cold, but she kept her composure. "A werewolf?" Jack nodded, his eyes wide with disbelief, his voice cracking as he continued. "Yeah, I was walking home with my dad after dinner, you know, from the restaurant near the forest. And then, out of nowhere, I saw it. It was huge. It was pacing, like it was waiting for something, but it wasn't scared. It was just roaming around, like it owned the place. I've never been so scared in my life. I ran straight home." Riva took a slow breath, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. "But what were you doing out there so late?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Jack rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "We were just coming back from dinner. My dad likes those late-night dinners sometimes." Riva paused, staring at Jack, her mind working quickly. There it was again, the forest, the creature. She had seen the same thing, or at least something just as monstrous. But now, hearing Jack's account, a terrible realization crept in. "Jack," Riva said, her voice suddenly softer, "I have to tell you something." Jack looked at her, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What's up?" Riva hesitated. The weight of her knowledge was heavy, but Jack deserved to know the truth. "I saw a werewolf too last night, and—" She took a deep breath, trying to calm the unease that still gripped her. "I know who it is." Jack blinked, a frown forming on his face. "Wait, you're serious? Who? You've got to be kidding. How do you know?" Riva looked Jack squarely in the eye, her voice unwavering. "It's someone from this college. Someone we know." Jack shook his head, clearly not believing her. "No way. That's impossible. Who could be a werewolf? We're talking about a monster here." Riva's gaze hardened. "I'm certain about who it is, Jack. I've seen enough to know, and I have proof." Jack's confusion quickly turned to concern. What proof? What are you talking about? Riva pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers trembling slightly as she unlocked it. She opened the video and handed the phone to Jack without a word. His eyes darted between the screen and Riva as he watched, his expression going from disbelief to sheer terror. "What the hell?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. The video clearly showed Avon in the forest, transforming into a werewolf, his body contorting, his bones snapping, his muscles rippling as he changed shape. Jack watched as Avon, a creature now beyond recognition, hunted a small animal with chilling efficiency. "Holy crap," Jack muttered under his breath, his face pale. That's Avon? How could— "I told you," Riva cut in, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "It's Avon. I'm sure of it. He's been trying to hurt me, Jack." Jack's eyes widened in horror, the weight of the situation settling in. You've got to show this to the police. They'll arrest him, Riva. This is evidence." Riva shook her head vehemently, pulling the phone away from him. "No, I can't. If I show them this video, if I tell them it's Avon, my life will be in even more danger. You don't understand, Jack. He's already tried to hurt me. If I hand over this video, he'll know, and I won't be safe anymore." Jack's eyes narrowed. "But you have to. This is bigger than us, Riva. Avon can't just keep roaming around hurting people. He'll kill someone." "I know," she said quietly, "but I can't risk it." Jack took a step closer, his voice more urgent. "You don't get it. Give me the video, and I'll submit it to the police. I'll pretend I made it. That way no one will know it came from you, and we can still make sure Avon is stopped." Riva's grip tightened on her phone. "No, Jack. I'm not giving it to you. I can't." Jack stood there for a moment, staring at her in stunned silence, before sighing in frustration. "You're making a mistake, Riva. A big one." Riva turned away, feeling the weight of her decision. She didn't know if she was doing the right thing, but it was the only choice she felt she had left. Riva stood at the front of the classroom, her voice steady as she guided her students through the lesson. Yet, the sensation of being watched kept creeping into her thoughts. Every time she glanced up, her gaze collided with Avon's. His eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, like a predator waiting for its prey. She tried to ignore him, to focus on the task at hand, but it was impossible. His stare drilled into her, making the walls of the room feel like they were closing in. She could feel the tension in her body tightening, her pulse quickening. Avon wasn't just staring. He was waiting for something. A message? A signal? Riva's words faltered, and a wave of nausea swept over her. She couldn't take it anymore. She abruptly dropped the marker she had been using and walked to the door without a word, her breath shallow. The students stared, confused, but Riva didn't care. She just needed to get out of there. The hallway felt empty in comparison to the claustrophobic space of the classroom. Riva's thoughts raced as she made her way to the head's office. She wasn't sure what she planned to say, but she needed to do something, anything, to escape this feeling of constant danger. When she knocked on the head's door, she could barely contain the tension in her voice. "I need to change my class," she said, trying to sound calm. "I'm not feeling well in my current class." The head, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, looked up from his papers, his brow furrowing slightly. "It's not that simple, Riva," he said with a sigh. "You'll need to wait for a few weeks until we can accommodate the transfer. I understand you're not feeling comfortable, but that's the best we can do for now." Riva nodded, trying to mask the frustration bubbling inside her. Weeks. She couldn't wait that long. The pressure was mounting, and she had to do something now. As she left the office, her eyes caught sight of Avon once more. He was standing near the entrance, a few feet away, watching her like he had been waiting for her to leave. Riva's stomach twisted in knots. She needed to get away. But before she could turn and leave, Cooper appeared beside her. "Hey, Riva," Cooper said, a sheepish look on his face. "I owe you an apology for the other day. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I just wanted to be a good friend." Riva was barely listening. Her mind was fixed on Avon, who still stood motionless, his gaze unwavering. She couldn't stay here any longer, not with him watching her. She forced a smile at Cooper and nodded. "It's okay. You can give me a lift home, right? I need to get out of here." Cooper's eyes brightened at the suggestion. "Of course. I'd be happy to." They walked to his car, and as Riva slid into the passenger seat, she saw Avon still watching from a distance. He hadn't moved an inch. Riva tried to shake off the feeling of his eyes on her as Cooper started the car, pulling out of the parking lot. The drive was quiet, the tension between them thick but unspoken. Riva glanced out the window, her thoughts consumed by Avon, the werewolf, and the dangers she still faced. When they reached her house, Cooper pulled up to the curb, and Riva turned to him. "I'd like to offer you some coffee, if you don't mind," she said, the words slipping out before she could second-guess herself. Cooper's face lit up. "I'd love that." They both walked into her house, and Riva led him to the living room. She motioned for him to sit on the sofa while she prepared the coffee. As she worked, the sounds of the house, so familiar and soothing, did little to calm her nerves. She carried the coffee and snacks to the table and handed them to Cooper, who smiled appreciatively. But just as he took his first bite, the door swung open with a harsh creak. Riva's stomach lurched. It was Jester. Cooper stood up, his smile still intact. "Hey, Jester," he said with an easy tone. "It's good to meet you." Jester didn't answer. Instead, his gaze landed on Riva with cold fury, and his words shot out like venom. "Riva, you're a bitch. I knew it all along. You're sleeping with this man." Riva's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling. "Jester, what are you talking about? He's just my colleague," she said, her voice shaking. Cooper stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Jester, just calm down. I'm just a friend." But Jester wasn't listening. "You think I'm stupid?" he snapped. "You're having an affair with him, and I know it." Riva could feel her temper rising. "Jester, this is ridiculous. Why are you—" Before she could finish, Jester erupted into a tirade, shouting and swearing. Cooper stood there, silent and stoic, until Jester's abuse became too much. Without a word, he turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the door to swing shut with a loud bang. Riva stood in shock for a moment, staring after him. She had expected Jester to be angry, but not like this. She turned to face him, her frustration boiling over. "What's wrong with you? He's just my friend." Jester seemed to snap back to reality, his tone suddenly softening. "I'm sorry, baby," he said, his voice sugary sweet. "I didn't mean it. I was out of line." Riva, still reeling from the confrontation, narrowed her eyes. "Do you trust me?" Jester's expression shifted again, his eyes clouded with guilt. "Of course I do, my love. I'm sorry. I don't know. Can you call Cooper? I'll apologize to him." Riva was caught off guard. It all felt like a game, a manipulation. But she called Cooper anyway, watching as Jester patched things over with a fake apology. When the call ended, Jester's demeanor shifted again, and he asked for money. Riva's stomach churned. She knew it wasn't about trust. It was about money. Jester's temper had been a performance, all for the sake of getting what he wanted. With a sigh, Riva handed him the cash. She tried to explain the dangers she was facing, the werewolf, everything that had been haunting her. But Jester didn't listen. He simply took the money and walked out without a second glance, leaving Riva standing in the doorway, her hands trembling. She wanted to stop him, to make him understand. But Jester was already gone, and Riva was left alone, her fears growing darker by the minute. Riva sat alone in the living room, the silence pressing down on her like an invisible weight. The house felt emptier than usual, the corners of every room filled with shadows that seemed to grow longer with the passing hours. Jester hadn't come home since their argument, and Riva didn't expect him to. He was lost to his addiction, and it was the only thing he cared about now. Her thoughts swirled in a never-ending cycle of fear and confusion, and she could feel the walls closing in around her. The knock on the door broke her from her spiraling thoughts. She stood up quickly, her heart skipping a beat, but when she opened the door, her breath caught at the sight of Cooper standing there, his expression soft and understanding. I didn't mean to disturb you," he said, his voice gentle. "I just wanted to check in on you." Riva stepped aside to let him in, her mind racing. "I'm sorry about Jester's behavior," she said, her voice filled with regret. He's not like that usually." Cooper smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's all right. Sometimes I get a little out of line too," he replied, his tone light, as if trying to ease the tension. "No harm done." Riva offered him a seat on the couch and sat down beside him. She hesitated before speaking again. "I've been thinking about everything, and I'm not sure what to do anymore. Jester. He doesn't care about anything but his alcohol." Cooper's expression softened, his eyes warm with sympathy. "I understand," he said quietly, before his expression shifted slightly. "Jack told me about the werewolf. He said Avon's been following you." "Jack?" Riva repeated, her brow furrowing. "He told you?" Cooper nodded. "Jack is my son. He's the one who found out about Avon and everything else." Riva's thoughts raced as she absorbed this new information. "This needs to stay between us, Cooper," she said urgently. "Until Avon is arrested. He's been trying to attack me, more than once." Cooper's eyes darkened. "Avon hates you. That's why he's doing this," he said, his voice low. "But there's something you need to know." Riva's stomach tightened. "What is it?" Cooper paused, his gaze locking with hers. "I'm one of them." Riva blinked, her mind struggling to process his words. "One of them? What do you mean?" "I'm a werewolf too," Cooper said quietly, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken weight. "But unlike Avon, I can control myself." Riva felt her breath catch. A werewolf? The room seemed to close in around her, her mind scrambling to understand. Cooper was one of them, but he wasn't like Avon. "Don't be scared," Cooper said, sensing her fear. "I care about you, Riva. I'm here to protect you. I'll fight for you." Riva shook her head, her voice trembling. "I haven't done anything. I don't understand why this is happening to me." "I know," Cooper replied softly. "But we need to stop Avon before he hurts you. I can defeat him. I won't let him harm you." Riva's mind raced, the weight of his words sinking in. "I don't want you to fight him," she said quickly. "Once his real face is exposed, he'll be arrested. He won't be able to get away." Cooper looked at her, his expression firm. That's not enough. Avon's family is powerful. If he gets arrested, he'll get out. You can't wait for that. Riva looked down, her mind a swirl of confusion and uncertainty. I don't know what to do anymore, she whispered, her thoughts lingering on her marriage. Jester. He's not the man I married. I want to file for divorce. Cooper's hand reached out, gently squeezing hers. You deserve better, Riva. You don't have to stay with him. You can be free. The next day, Riva couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. Avon was absent from class, which was a rare occurrence, and Riva couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. The days that followed seemed calmer, but every time she glanced at Cooper, she felt the weight of their growing closeness. He had become someone she could rely on, someone who cared for her. But then, Avon returned. One day, after class, as Riva was walking to her car, Avon appeared in front of her, blocking her path. His eyes were cold, but there was a strange intensity behind them. Ma'am, I need to tell you something, he said, his voice low. Riva's breath caught in her throat, panic rising. She didn't want to hear anything he had to say. Without a word, she turned on her heel and walked away, her heart racing in her chest. For the next few days, Avon continued to approach her, trying to speak. But Riva kept her distance, her steps quick and purposeful. She couldn't afford to listen to him, not after everything that had happened. One afternoon, as she sat with Cooper in the college courtyard, the topic of Avon came up again. Maybe I should show the video to the police, Riva said, her voice shaky. He's still trying to talk to me. What if he does something worse next time? Cooper's face darkened. The only thing that will end this is a fight between me and Avon, he said, his tone serious. But I won't force you into it. I won't fight him unless you want me to. Riva's thoughts swirled. She couldn't bear the thought of losing either of them, Avon or Cooper. But she didn't want to fight. Not like this. I don't want you to fight, she said softly. I want this to be over peacefully. Once Avon is exposed, it's over. He'll be arrested. Cooper's expression was resolute. You're right, but he won't stay locked up for long. His family will get him out. We can't wait for that. Riva didn't know what to think anymore. The fight for her safety had become a battle she wasn't sure she was ready for, and the stakes were higher than ever before. The morning light spilled through the windows as Riva gathered her things to leave the college. She felt a strange sense of calm after the events of the past few days, but something nagged at the back of her mind, something she couldn't quite shake. As she walked toward the parking lot, her thoughts still tangled with the chaos of the past weeks, she was caught off guard when Jack suddenly appeared in front of her. Ma'am, my dad is cheating on you, Jack said bluntly, his expression serious. Riva froze, blinking in confusion. What? Cheating? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. Jack, I'm not in a relationship with Cooper. We've only just started dating a few days ago. Jack's face softened with a knowing look. But he's involved with another woman too. I've seen it. Riva's pulse quickened. Do you have any proof? She asked, her voice steady despite the shock that was beginning to rise in her chest. Without a word, Jack pulled out his phone and swiped through some photos, then handed it to her. The images were clear. Cooper with another woman, kissing her outside a cafe. Riva's gaze flicked to the date, just a few days ago. Riva felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. Thanks for telling me, Jack, she said, trying to maintain her composure. But I've already told you, I'm not in a relationship with Cooper. Jack's expression softened, as if relieved by her response. But you're about to be. Riva's eyes narrowed. Maybe, maybe not. But as you've shown me proof, I'll move on. Her voice was firm, but the nagging feeling in her chest refused to disappear. Cooper and I didn't have that deep of a friendship anyway. Jack seemed to relax, a subtle smile tugging at his lips, but Riva, despite her best efforts, couldn't shake the confusion gnawing at her. If Cooper was interested in another woman, then why had he acted so differently toward her? Why had he made it seem like he wanted something more? Just as Riva turned to leave, she saw Cooper approaching from the corner of her eye. He smiled at her, a warm, familiar smile that didn't quite match the heaviness of her thoughts.
"Riva, let's go,"
he called out. Riva hesitated. "I have some things to take care of," she said, her tone distant. "I'll meet you later." Cooper's face fell slightly, but he didn't press her. He turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the distance. Riva sighed and began walking down the street toward home, her thoughts still spiraling. As she walked, her gaze flicked across the street, and there, standing together, were Avon and Jack, talking in low voices. Riva's instincts kicked in. She didn't want to be seen, didn't want to get caught in whatever conversation they were having. She quickened her pace, her mind racing. The next day, Riva couldn't hold back her questions. "Jack, what were you talking about with Avon yesterday?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even, but there was a hint of concern in her tone. Jack looked uncomfortable for a moment before answering. "Ma'am, I was just trying to protect you. Avon, he said he was going to attack you again." Riva's blood ran cold. "What?" she whispered, trying to make sense of his words. "Did you tell Avon that we know what he is? That he's a werewolf?" Jack fell silent, his eyes flickering away from hers. Riva's suspicions were confirmed. He had told Avon. "Why would you do that, Jack?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You've put us all in danger." Jack's eyes darkened with guilt. Without warning, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Riva in a tight hug. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I just care about you. I didn't want you to get hurt. I'm scared." Riva was taken aback, but gently pulled away from the hug. "Don't worry. But you shouldn't have told Avon," she said firmly. She could see the fear in his eyes, but there was no excuse for what he had done. Just as Riva was about to turn and walk away, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She spun around, startled, and found Cooper standing there, his face a mask of uncertainty. Before Riva could say anything, Cooper leaned in and kissed her on the cheek. Riva's breath caught, and she took a step back, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaky, trying to process his sudden, unexpected gesture. Cooper's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low. Riva took a deep breath, her mind clearer now, but still tangled in the web of emotions. "I need time, Cooper," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I know you're dating someone else." Cooper looked taken aback, his expression a mix of hurt and disbelief. "I'm not dating anyone," he said quickly, his voice pleading. "It's not what it looks like." Riva shook her head, a quiet resolve settling in her chest. "I know what I saw. You don't have to explain." Without another word, Riva turned and walked away, her steps quick as she tried to put some distance between herself and the confusion that had been growing between them. The evening had settled into an unsettling stillness in Riva's home. The silence felt suffocating, as though the weight of the past few days had thickened the space around her. She sat alone in the dimly lit living room, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and confusion. Jester had been missing for the past few days, and Riva couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. The house felt empty. But it wasn't just the physical absence of her husband. It was a deeper, more personal emptiness. She remembered the conversation she'd had with the police earlier in the day. She had reported Jester's disappearance and filed for divorce, finally deciding she couldn't endure the torment any longer. The weight of her decision wasn't lost on her, but at least it felt like a small step toward taking back control of her life. Her fingers traced the divorce papers still lying on the table. Just then, a sudden knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Riva hesitated before getting up to open it. When she saw who it was, her heart skipped. Jack stood there, his expression tense, his eyes darting around nervously. His sudden appearance caught her off guard. "Jack, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. Jack swallowed hard, his face a mask of worry. "I have to tell you something," he said, his voice low and strained. Riva's curiosity piqued, and she stepped aside to let him in. As soon as the door closed behind him, Jack started speaking, his words spilling out in a rush. "Cooper, he knows I showed you those photos. He's angry with me, really angry. Last night he attacked me. He tried to hurt me." Riva's stomach dropped, and without thinking, she rushed forward to wrap Jack in a tight hug. The shock of his words hit her like a freight train. "Oh my God, Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to report this to the police. Cooper can't get away with this. He's trying to harm his own son." Jack pulled away slightly, his face grim. "It's worse than that, Riva. Cooper's dangerous. I can't stay here anymore. I need to move. I'm going to leave the city." Riva's mind raced, confusion sweeping over her. "Another city? Alone?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Why would you?" Jack interrupted, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made Riva uncomfortable. "Why don't you come with me? You're scared too, aren't you? You don't have to stay here living in fear. We could go somewhere safe. Together." Riva felt a cold shiver trickle down her spine. His words were wrapped in concern, but there was something off about the way he was looking at her. Her voice faltered slightly as she responded, "Yes, I'm scared, but this isn't something I can just leave behind. I can't come with you." Jack stepped closer, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. The touch, meant to be comforting, sent a surge of discomfort through her. She shifted uncomfortably under his touch, but Jack didn't seem to notice.
"Riva, I care for you,"
he said, his voice low, almost pleading.
"I need you."
Riva took a sharp breath, her discomfort growing. The way he spoke, the way his hands lingered on her shoulders, it all felt wrong. "Jack," she said, her voice hardening, "you're my student. What are you talking about?" Before Riva could move away, Jack's face hardened with an expression she hadn't seen before. Without warning, he leaned in, his lips inches from hers. In that split second, her instincts kicked in. She took a step back, pushing him away with force. "Get out," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Now!" Jack's face twisted with frustration, but he didn't move.
"Only I can protect you, Riva,"
he said, his tone turning dark. Riva didn't flinch. "I said get out!" she shouted, her voice loud and commanding. "I don't want you here, not like this." For a long moment, Jack stared at her, his jaw clenched tight. Anger flickered in his eyes, but he finally turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him with a resounding bang. Riva stood there, breathing heavily, her mind a whirl of confusion and fear. Her heart was still racing, but now it was the fear of what Jack might do next, not the fear of Cooper. She leaned against the door, trying to steady herself. What the hell just happened? Riva's thoughts were interrupted by the quiet sound of her phone buzzing on the table. She glanced at it, but for the first time in a long time, the thought of answering didn't feel like the right thing to do. Instead, she stood there, staring at the door Jack had just left through, and wondered how much further she would be dragged into the mess she had never asked for. Riva stood in the middle of her living room, her thoughts swirling in a whirlwind of disbelief and anger. What the hell is going on? She thought, her pulse still racing from the events of the night. She had never imagined that Jack, of all people, would be the one to betray her trust. She had always believed him to be a kind-hearted, well-meaning student, but now the truth hung heavy in the air, suffocating her. Jack's actions, his sudden confession of protection, his attempt to kiss her, all of it had been a ploy, a calculated move to get closer to her. He hadn't been trying to help, he had been trying to possess. But as the anger simmered, a cold knot of confusion tightened in her stomach. Why would Jack say he could protect me? She wondered. The idea of Jack thinking he could protect her, especially from Cooper, was laughable and disturbing. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Without another thought, she grabbed her coat and stormed out of the house. She had to confront someone, anyone, who could shed light on the truth. Her steps were quick, purposeful as she made her way to Cooper's house. The evening sky was dark, the streets quiet, but the tension in her mind drowned out everything around her. When she arrived at Cooper's place, she waited in the shadows, watching for any sign of movement. She knew Cooper and Jack would be leaving soon. It wasn't long before she saw them step outside, talking amongst themselves, oblivious to her presence. As soon as they were out of sight, Riva quietly approached the front door and knocked. The door swung open, revealing a woman with soft, kind eyes and a warm smile. Riva quickly composed herself, putting on the mask of a polite teacher. "Hi, I'm here to speak with Jack," she said, her voice steady but with an underlying edge of curiosity. "I'm his teacher, Riva." The woman's smile grew wider. "Oh, you must be Riva. Jack talks about you a lot. Please, come in." Riva stepped inside, her mind racing with questions she wasn't sure how to ask. The house was warm and inviting, nothing like the cold atmosphere she had left behind at her own place. The woman led her to the living room, where she motioned for Riva to sit. "I'm Tina, Jack's mother," she said, her voice soft but with a hint of caution. Riva froze. Jack's mother? She had expected someone older, maybe distant, but this woman appeared to be in her late 30s, no older than 40. She hadn't expected this at all. Tina seemed to sense Riva's surprise. "I know. Jack, he's not always easy to understand. But we do our best." Riva took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't the conversation she had planned, but now that she was here, it felt like a moment of reckoning. "I'm actually here because Jack has been acting out lately. He's been distracted, withdrawn, not focusing in class. He's been very depressed and I'm concerned." Tina's face softened. "Yes, I know. Jack's been having a hard time with a few things. But I also know there's something he hasn't been telling me. You're Riva, right?" "Yes, I am." "How did you know?" Riva asked. Her curiosity piqued. Tina sighed, as if deciding how much to share. "Riva, Jack is different. He has a history of being attracted to older women. He had a crush on one of his teachers back when he was in 8th grade, and I'm afraid now it's you he's focused on." Riva felt a sudden surge of discomfort. Jack had a crush on one of his teachers? The realization hit hard. She was part of a pattern, nothing more than a target in Jack's mind. But Tina wasn't finished. "Don't misunderstand," Tina continued. "I'm not saying it's your fault. I know you're a good person, and I don't have a problem with you. But Jack, he's not a typical young man. He gets obsessed, and he doesn't know how to handle his feelings properly." Riva's mind raced, piecing the story together. So he's been trying to get closer to me, in a way I didn't understand. But that's not all, Tina. He came to my house recently. He tried to kiss me. On the lips. It was completely inappropriate. Tina's expression darkened, and her eyes glinted with a mix of regret and concern. Riva, you're not the first. He's tried this with others before. I've kept quiet about it, thinking it was a phase. But this time it's different. He's obsessed with you. Riva felt a wave of nausea hit her, but Tina's words were blunt and clear. Jack is not a good person in this way. I'm his mother, and I should have seen it sooner. But as a woman, I'm telling you, keep your distance from him, for your own sake. Don't think that I'm blaming you. I'm not. You're a good woman, and I respect you. Riva stood there, stunned into silence. The weight of Tina's words settled over her like a thick fog. She had never anticipated this. Jack's behavior wasn't just inappropriate, it was disturbing. And now she understood that this wasn't a one-time incident. It was a pattern. A dangerous one. I understand, Riva managed, her voice hoarse. She turned to leave, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. As she stepped out of the house, the world outside seemed quieter, but the storm inside her head raged on. She had been blind to Jack's true nature, and now she had to deal with the aftermath. How did I let it go this far? The truth was clearer now. She had to stay far away from Jack, far away from the mess he had created in her life. Riva's mind raced as she left Tina's house. Her thoughts were a mess, tangled in confusion and disbelief. She hadn't expected her life to spiral like this. Jack, Cooper, and now Avon. Everything seemed to be spiraling out of control. She stopped for a moment, gathering her thoughts. What am I going to do now? She wondered. She had a vague idea of what might come next, but the uncertainty weighed heavily on her. I'm in trouble, she muttered to herself. I may have to move to another city soon. As she walked, her feet dragging in the dimming light of the evening, her thoughts collided with the reality of the mess she had found herself in. The truth about Jack's behavior, Tina's warnings, and her own tangled emotions were overwhelming. Suddenly, as she rounded a corner, she froze. In front of her stood a figure, a tall, dark shape with glowing eyes. A werewolf. Its features were blurred in the shadows, but the menacing presence was unmistakable. Her pulse shot up, and she immediately spun on her heel, running as fast as she could. Her shoes slapped against the pavement, but the sound of claws scraping on concrete told her that the werewolf was gaining on her. She tried to push harder, but it was no use. Before she could even take another step, the creature was right behind her. It reached out with a clawed hand, grazing her knees. She gasped, stumbling forward, but then a loud shot rang through the night air. The werewolf's body jerked, falling limp to the ground with a sickening thud. Riva looked up, her breath catching. Cooper stood before her, the barrel of a shotgun still smoking. She hadn't realized how close she had come to being torn apart by the creature. Thank you, she said shakily, her voice barely a whisper. Cooper lowered the shotgun. It's Avon. But don't worry, he won't die from this. Werewolves are tough. He'll be out for a while, though. Riva nodded, still trying to catch her breath. Was it Avon? She asked, her voice edged with disbelief. He was trying to hurt me. Cooper nodded grimly. He was. But he won't be getting up anytime soon. There was a heavy silence, broken only by the soft echo of distant traffic. Riva suddenly felt the weight of the night pressing down on her once again. Cooper. Avon. Jack. She turned to him. Cooper, she began, her words deliberate. Why are you cheating on your wife? Cooper gave her a sharp, incredulous look.
I'm not cheating. I'm separated. I don't live with my wife anymore,
he said, his voice cool but tinged with frustration. Riva shook her head, her eyes narrowing. I already went to your house. I know you have a wife. So why are you dating me? Cooper didn't hesitate. He stepped closer, his voice low and urgent.
Riva, I love you. I know you don't feel the same, but I couldn't keep it in any longer.
Her jaw clenched. You love me? She said incredulously. If you love me, why are you still with her? Why were you even with me in the first place? Cooper looked away, a shadow of guilt crossing his face.
My wife. She's not the person I thought she was. She's been cheating on me. I can't stay in that. But you, Riva, you're different.
Riva's hands trembled, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Cooper, I'm not different, she said softly. You're the one who's been lying. You're the one who's been cheating. You're not the victim here. He caught her arm, pulling her closer, his eyes desperate. And what about you? You're still married to Jester, and yet you've already filed for divorce. Isn't that cheating too? Riva's face flushed with anger. Jester doesn't love me, she snapped, her voice rising. And you know that. We've been separated for a long time now. The court accepted the divorce. We're just waiting on a few formalities. Cooper's eyes flickered with something close to anger.
So now you're free? Is that what you want, Riva?
He asked, his tone almost mocking. Why don't you marry me? We could be together, no strings attached. Riva recoiled at his words. Are you crazy? She spat. You still have a wife. And what about Jack? You have a son. Don't you care about him? Cooper's face twisted with rage. Jack is the worst kind of son. He tried to tear us apart. You have no idea what he's done to me. Riva's chest tightened as she realized what Cooper was implying.
No, Cooper. Jack only showed me the truth about you. He's not the one tearing anything apart.
Cooper's lip curled.
He told you the truth about himself, didn't he? Did he tell you he wants to sleep with you? He sneered. Jack likes every middle-aged woman. But you know what? Maybe you want to sleep with my son, too.
Riva's hands balled into fists. The anger rose like a tide in her chest. Without thinking, she slapped Cooper across the face, the sound of the impact echoing in the quiet street. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, her body trembling with fury. Get away from me, Cooper, she said, her voice cold and hard. And never come near me again. Cooper stood frozen, his cheek red where she had struck him, his eyes wild with frustration. Without another word, Riva turned and walked away, her steps firm and resolute. The night had gotten darker, but Riva didn't care. She was done, and nothing would stop her from taking control of her life again. Riva's footsteps echoed through the quiet hallway as she reached her front door, her mind still spinning with the events of the past few hours. Cooper's words, Avon's threats, and Jack's unsettling behavior had left her unsettled, on edge, and questioning everything she thought she knew. When she entered her house, the familiar feeling of safety she once had quickly slipped away. Something felt off. The hair on the back of her neck prickled as she stepped further into the living room, noticing small signs that something had been disturbed. A chair slightly pushed out of place, a book left open on the table, and the distinct feeling that someone had been there when she wasn't around. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively moved toward the kitchen, her eyes scanning every corner. Her gaze fell on the table. A folded piece of paper sat in the center, its edges slightly crinkled. Her stomach turned as she approached it, her hand trembling as she picked it up. The note was written in neat, careful handwriting, though there was something unsettling about its tone.
Ma'am, I had kept this note in your table because I had tried to tell the truth many times, but you had not listened. Yes, I am a werewolf, as you already know. What do you think? You had seen me and I had not seen you. I had seen you there in the deep woods. You were filming me. I know everything. I also know that you had complained and reported to the nearest police station. You were scared, I know, but it was a secret, and I had not told anyone about my werewolf form. You think you were the first who knows that I am a werewolf? Well, you are wrong in this case. Jack already knew that I am a werewolf, and also to mention that Cooper also knew that I am a werewolf. Now, one thing you don't know is that Cooper is also a werewolf, and Jack is also a werewolf. I am telling you these all things because I only want to tell you that I had some problems with you when you joined my class as a teacher. I did not like you at all, but slowly I tried to change myself. I don't know what just happened to me, but when I saw you the first day, I was overwhelmed by your charm. But when you tried to make Jack better than me, I was jealous of you as well as Jack. But slowly I realized that you had not done anything wrong. You were only trying to make every student better and better. And then I started liking you more. And here comes the truth. I had not attacked you even a single time. It was not me. I don't know who it was, or maybe it was Cooper, or maybe some other werewolf, but I was not that werewolf who tried to attack you. I am saying all this to you because I only want to say that I don't have any problem with you. In fact, I like you very much, but I can't say it directly because you are my teacher, and I know my limits. And I promise that I will never create any problem in your life, and I will never approach you in a romantic way, because I know I am a student of yours. Reva felt the room spin as she read the note. The words burned into her mind, but the more she read, the more conflicted she became. Avon? A werewolf? Was he being truthful? She wanted to believe him, but her instincts screamed at her not to trust anyone anymore. Her hands clenched into fists. How could she trust him? Avon had always been a rebellious troublemaker, and he had a history of causing chaos. But the note, it was genuine, at least in its emotions. Her mind flashed back to the tension she'd felt when Avon first arrived in her class, the way he'd kept to himself, always with that unreadable expression. Could it be true? Could he really have kept his feelings hidden for so long? But there was too much at stake, too much uncertainty. Cooper, a cheater, Jack, a manipulative womanizer, and Avon, a werewolf. The world she thought she knew was falling apart around her. She couldn't trust any of them, not a single one. Without thinking, Reva moved to her bedroom and began gathering her things. Clothes, toiletries, anything that could be packed quickly. She didn't know what to do or where to go, but she couldn't stay here, not with everything that had happened. She couldn't trust anyone anymore, and the thought of facing any of them again made her stomach churn. She had to leave. She needed a fresh start, far away from this mess. A new city, a new life. Maybe there she could escape the lies, the betrayal, and the danger. Her hands worked quickly, packing clothes into bags, throwing her life into the chaos of a suitcase. But even as she moved, doubt crept in. Could she really leave it all behind? Was it even safe to go, knowing what she now knew about Cooper, Jack, and Avon? The thought of running away made her feel small, defeated. But the truth was, she didn't know who she could trust anymore. Her world was full of secrets, lies, and creatures she couldn't even begin to understand. When the last of her belongings were packed, she stood in the middle of the room, staring at her empty life. There was nothing left for her here. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. With one final glance at the home she had once felt safe in, Reva turned and walked out the door. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. It was time to leave everything behind.
Riva stood by the curb, her suitcase in hand, her mind swirling with confusion and fear. The weight of the decisions she had been forced to make, the lies she had uncovered, and the betrayal she had endured, all crashed down on her as she waited for the cab to take her away. She was leaving everything behind. Her job, her life in this city, the men who had manipulated her, and she couldn't help but feel that maybe running away was the only choice she had left. The headlights of a car appeared in the distance, drawing closer. Riva's stomach twisted, a sense of dread washing over her. When the cab finally rolled to a stop in front of her, the door swung open and her blood ran cold. It wasn't a random driver. It was Cooper.
"Riva!"
Cooper's voice cut through the air, low and commanding.
"If you don't accept us, then you will have to sacrifice your life."
Her pulse quickened, and instinctively she took a step back. Her eyes darted to the street, searching for an escape, but then her gaze landed on someone standing at the end of the alley. Jack. Her escape route was blocked. She froze. Trapped. Cooper stepped out of the cab, a dark smile curling on his lips as he advanced toward her.
"You think you can run from this? You belong to us, Riva. All of us."
The words stung. She had been manipulated, betrayed, and now she was caught in a web of lies.
"No, you're all the same,"
Riva spat back, her voice trembling with anger.
"Liars, cheaters. I won't be a part of your sick game."
Jack's expression softened, and he took a step forward, his voice pleading.
"Riva, don't trust him,"
he said, his eyes filled with regret.
"It was Cooper who told me to attack you. It was me that tried to hurt you that day, but I swear, I never wanted to. I love you. Please, come with me."
Riva's breath caught in her throat. It had never been Avon. All this time she had blamed him, but now she understood the truth. Jack was the one who had tried to harm her, not Avon. Her heart sank as the weight of the realization hit her. She was trapped, suffocated by the deceit that had surrounded her from all sides. Cooper's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts.
"What do you decide, Riva? You can choose to be with us, or choose your death."
Riva's fists clenched at her sides. The last of her patience snapped.
"What do you want?"
she demanded. Cooper smirked, his eyes dark and predatory.
"Marry me?"
"No," Jack interjected, his voice desperate.
"Marry me."
Riva's gaze shifted between them. The two men she had thought she could trust, the two men who had torn her apart. The thought of accepting either one of their proposals repulsed her.
"Kill me,"
she said, her voice cold, broken.
"I won't marry either of you. Is that clear?"
She was exhausted, defeated. The depression she had fought to suppress for so long had finally overtaken her. She no longer cared. The betrayal had cut too deep, and she didn't want to live in a world full of lies, deceit, and pain. Cooper and Jack exchanged a glance, and then, without warning, both of them began to transform. Riva's eyes widened in shock as their bodies contorted and changed before her. Fur sprouted, claws elongated, and snarls filled the air. The two werewolves stood before her, massive and terrifying. In that moment, she surrendered. She had given up. It was her end, the final chapter in a life that had once held so much promise. She closed her eyes, preparing for the inevitable. But then, a deafening roar shattered the night. From the shadows emerged a massive figure, an enormous werewolf, far larger than any she had seen before. His eyes glowed like molten gold as he charged forward with terrifying speed. Behind him, a pack of wolves followed, their bodies strong and fierce. Riva stumbled back,
eyes wide with fear. Was this the end? But the giant werewolf did not attack her. Instead, the pack descended upon Cooper and Jack, their claws and teeth ripping into the two men with a brutal force. The fight was over in moments. Cooper and Jack lay motionless on the ground, their bodies bloodied and broken, struggling to take shallow breaths. The giant werewolf stood over Riva, his golden eyes fixed on her. For a long, silent moment, he stared at her as if weighing her soul. Riva's legs shook, her heart racing. She braced herself for the inevitable strike, but the werewolf simply turned away. With a final glance, he led his pack into the forest, vanishing into the shadows. Riva stood there, trembling. The adrenaline that had surged through her now left her weak and disoriented. She couldn't comprehend what had just happened, the events unfolding faster than she could process. Jack and Cooper were alive, but barely. They were lying in a pool of blood, their breaths shallow, their bodies broken. Riva didn't care. They had chosen their fate. Without a word, she turned and ran. She didn't stop until she reached the airport, her heart a whirlwind of emotions. She didn't know who had saved her, but a part of her couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, it was Avon. She boarded a flight to a new city, to a new life. She joined another college, started teaching again. But in the quiet moments, when she let her mind wander, she couldn't help but wonder who the giant werewolf was. Was it Avon? Or someone else entirely? She would never know for sure, but she had to move on. She had survived. And that was all that mattered now. Riva walked through the busy streets of the city, her footsteps quiet against the pavement as the world bustled around her. Despite the crowd, her mind remained distant, lost in the thoughts of the past few weeks. She had settled into her new life, far away from the chaos that had once consumed her, but there was still an emptiness lingering in her heart, an unanswered question, a truth she could never quite grasp. As she passed a cafe, a figure caught her eye. A young man was walking in the opposite direction, his head down, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. There was something familiar about his posture, the way he moved. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization struck her. It was Avon. For a moment, Riva hesitated, unsure whether to approach him. After everything that had happened, after all the confusion and lies, she wasn't sure what kind of reception she would receive. But then, she remembered. Avon had been the only one who had told her the truth. He had never lied to her. The other men, Jack and Cooper, had twisted her reality. But Avon had always been straight with her, no matter how painful the truth was. She quickened her pace, closing the distance between them. As she reached him, she took a deep breath and called out, "Avon, after a long time, how are you?" Avon stopped walking, his shoulders stiffening slightly. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I'm good," he said, his voice cold and distant. "I have to leave." Riva felt a pang of regret. Before she could stop herself, the words slipped out. "So it wasn't you?" Avon paused for a long moment, his back to her. Slowly, he turned, his eyes meeting hers. "It was me," he said quietly. "It was always me who cared for you. It was me who saved your life that day when Jack and Cooper trapped you. But it doesn't matter. I'm your student. I can't just love you. It's not right." Riva's heart sank, the weight of his words hitting her harder than she expected. She had been wrong about him, so wrong. She had always thought of him as dangerous, something to be wary of. But now she knew the truth, and it crushed her. "Avon, please don't go," she begged, her voice breaking. But Avon didn't turn back. He walked away, his steps steady, resolute.
Riva stood frozen, watching him disappear into the crowd. Regret washed over her in waves. She had pushed him away when all he had ever wanted was to help her. She had been blind to the truth. She tried searching for him afterward, desperate to explain, to apologize, but he was gone. No trace of him remained. Riva felt the weight of her mistake settle heavily in her chest. She had lost him, and she wasn't sure if there was any way to make things right. Riva walked briskly down the streets toward her rented flat, her thoughts swirling around the events of the past few weeks. Teaching at the new college had been a welcome distraction, but the emptiness inside her lingered. She couldn't shake the image of Avon's face when he had walked away from her, and now, the reality of her choices weighed heavily on her. As she neared her building, a voice called out, pulling her from her thoughts.
"Hey, beautiful!"
Riva turned slightly, not acknowledging the voice at first, but the student's tone grew more insistent, more vulgar.
"You think you're so special, huh? Just look at you."
She kept walking, ignoring the offensive remarks. But then, the student's footsteps quickened, and before Riva could react, he was right behind her, his hand reaching out to touch her arm in a way that made her skin crawl. Instinctively, Riva stepped back, her heart racing in irritation. But before she could say anything, a figure appeared out of nowhere. A strong hand shot forward, connecting with the student's face with a solid punch. The student stumbled backward, cursing and holding his face. Riva blinked, her breath catching as she looked up at the young man who had intervened. She hadn't seen him in so long, but there was no mistaking that face. It was Avon. She stood there, shocked, as Avon stood over the student, who was now retreating in embarrassment. "Avon," Riva said, her voice soft, almost uncertain.
"Had you moved to this city?"
Avon's jaw clenched, his eyes avoiding hers.
"I'm really feeling shame on me for liking you,"
he muttered.
"Please don't talk. Let me go."
Riva's heart twisted at his words. She hadn't realized just how much he had struggled with his feelings for her. He had been there for her when no one else was, yet she had pushed him away. "You are a good person, Avon," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity. "I really mean it. You've already proven that your affection and feelings for me are true. This isn't some fantasy you want to live out. This is your honest emotion, and I respect that. I've always respected you." Avon's expression softened for just a moment, and he looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and sadness.
"Thank you,"
he whispered, before turning away. Riva reached out instinctively, but before she could say anything more, Avon was already walking away, disappearing into the distance as quickly as he had come. Her heart felt heavy. The words she had wanted to say stuck in her throat. She watched him go, silently wishing she could turn back time and make things right. But it was too late now. 1 year had passed since Riva had settled into her new life, teaching at the college she had moved to. She had thrown herself into her work, trying to forget the memories of Jack, Cooper, and Avon, trying to push them aside as distant echoes of a life she no longer wished to be a part of. But there were days when the emptiness lingered, especially when she found herself alone with her thoughts. It was during one of those moments, as she entered the staff room to prepare for her lesson, that a surprising announcement was made. A new teacher was joining the college. A man, they said, who would be teaching in the same department as hers. Riva glanced up absent-mindedly, expecting the usual introduction of a colleague. But when the door opened and a young man stepped in, she froze. It was Avon. The same man who had once been her student, the man she had pushed away so many times. He stood at the door, his eyes briefly meeting hers before he quickly looked away. His face was more mature now, but there was no mistaking the sadness in his eyes. For a moment, Riva's heart ached. She could see it now. Avon still held something for her, something deep and unspoken, but it was clear he was trying to bury it. He avoided her gaze, and Riva understood immediately. He felt shame for harboring feelings for his teacher, and that understanding made her own heart heavy. She didn't approach him. She respected his boundaries, though a part of her longed to reach out, to say something, anything, to bridge the gap between them. But she couldn't. It felt wrong to break the unspoken distance, to acknowledge what neither of them had ever fully confronted. Later that evening, as Riva walked home from work, something compelled her to follow him. She had no plan, no exact reason, only the need to understand, to see him again. She trailed behind him at a distance, watching as he turned a corner and disappeared down a quiet street. Her curiosity led her to an unfamiliar apartment building. She saw Avon enter, and she hesitated, her thoughts racing. Riva waited. She didn't know what drove her to do it, but she needed to understand. After some time, when the coast was clear and Avon was gone, she took a deep breath and approached the building. Her heart pounded as she made her way to a side window. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but she couldn't stop herself. Riva broke the window open with a small, precise motion, slipping inside with careful determination. The flat was modest, yet something about it felt intensely personal. As she moved through the space, she couldn't help but be drawn to the walls. They were lined with portraits of her. There were dozens of them, in various styles and mediums, each capturing her with a tenderness and respect that left her breathless. In that moment, Riva's heart stopped. Every room in the flat seemed to be an homage to her. Avon had kept these portraits, these silent testaments to his admiration. Even his laptop's wallpaper was a photo of her, taken on Teacher's Day some years ago. The image captured her laughing, unguarded, an image she had long since forgotten. And then, her eyes landed on a diary. She couldn't resist. Slowly, she opened it, and the first page caught her attention. Today I saw my sweet, beautiful teacher, Riva ma'am. She was looking so pretty and sweet as she always looks. I wanted to hug her forever, but I couldn't. I don't want to give a bad impression of myself to her. At least Riva thinks I am a good person, and that's enough for me. Riva's breath caught in her throat. She read on, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. I will never marry anyone. I love my teacher, my sweet, beautiful teacher. I love you, Riva ma'am. The words were simple, raw, and honest. Nothing like the fantasies she had expected. Avon hadn't written about desires or fantasies. He had written about his deep respect for her, his quiet affection, and his unspoken love. It was all there, laid bare in the pages of his diary. Riva's mind spun as she processed what she had read. She had never imagined that Avon's feelings for her had been this pure, this respectful. A mix of guilt and awe washed over her. She had been so wrong about him. For the first time, Riva realized how deeply Avon had cared for her, not for what she could give, but for who she was. A part of her began to see Avon in a new light, and she couldn't help but feel something stir in her heart. Maybe there was more to this than she had allowed herself to believe. She closed the diary slowly, her fingers lingering on the pages. She didn't know what to do with the emotions flooding her. But one thing was certain. Avon had always been there, his feelings for her far truer than she had ever realized. And now, Riva found herself wondering if it was too late to make things right. Riva's fingers trembled as she closed the diary, the weight of what she had just read settling in her chest. The truth was there, etched in Avon's words, and it was so much more than she had ever imagined. His love for her was not the wild fantasy she had feared, but something pure, something deep and rooted in respect. It was a love that had been hidden, unspoken for so long. And yet, here it was, now, painfully obvious. The sound of the door creaking open startled her. Riva looked up, her heart sinking when she saw Avon standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. His eyes locked onto the diary in her hands, and a heavy silence filled the room. Riva felt a flush of embarrassment sweep over her. She had crossed a line she shouldn't have, and now there was no way to undo it. "Avon, I am really so sorry," Riva said quickly, her voice shaky. "I don't know what I was looking for. It's all my fault. I know I shouldn't have read your diary. I shouldn't have entered your flat this way. I should go." Her words tumbled out in a rush, her guilt washing over her in waves. She stood up, ready to leave, but Avon's voice stopped her. "You shouldn't have read my diary, Riva. It's not right," he said, his voice soft yet firm. "But it's okay. Please, just leave now." Riva stood frozen, unsure of what to do. She had never felt so conflicted, so torn between respecting his wishes and the overwhelming pull she felt toward him now. The emotional connection between them, fueled by the honesty in that diary, made it impossible for her to walk away. Something in her, something deep and unexplainable, refused to let her leave. She couldn't. Not again. She had pushed him away so many times before, but now she understood him. She understood everything. Without thinking, without even knowing if it was the right thing to do, Riva stepped back inside the flat. Her breath caught in her throat as she moved closer to him. Before Avon could say another word, she reached for him, her fingers brushing against his chest as she leaned in. Without hesitation, she kissed him, her lips finding his in a kiss that was both urgent and gentle, full of all the things they had never said, full of everything they had hidden. Avon stiffened for a moment, but then his arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer. The warmth of his embrace enveloped her, and Riva melted into him, feeling the long years of separation, of misunderstanding, finally dissolve between them. He kissed her back with a desperation that matched her own, as though he too had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the right time. Riva felt his lips move against hers, soft and tender at first, but then deepening as their connection intensified. She felt his breath against her skin, his heartbeat in sync with hers, and everything in the world felt like it had fallen into place. She could feel the longing he had hidden for so long, and it was all directed at her. Riva, the woman who had once been so out of reach. As they broke the kiss, Avon stepped back slightly, his eyes searching hers, but without warning, he moved toward her again. This time, his lips found her neck, and Riva gasped, her body responding to the intensity of the sensation. His lips trailed down the side of her neck, soft and warm against her skin, and she closed her eyes, letting herself feel everything. The love he had written about, the respect he had always shown her, was now translated into each tender kiss, each soft touch. Riva couldn't help but shiver under his affection. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, as though the connection between them was something destined, something meant to be. Her hands moved to the buttons of her shirt, her fingers trembling slightly as she undid them, her heart racing with every motion. Avon watched her, his eyes dark with desire, but there was no rush. His hands rested gently on her arms, guiding her as if he were cherishing every moment. When she opened her shirt, revealing her skin beneath, Avon kissed her neck once more, this time moving lower, his lips trailing down her collarbone. Riva's breath hitched, her pulse quickening as she felt the intensity of their connection deepen. She could feel his warmth, his love, his every emotion pouring into her with each kiss. Riva closed the buttons of her shirt with shaky hands, but she didn't step away. She stood before him, vulnerable yet alive with something she hadn't felt in years. "See you in college," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with something new, something hopeful. Avon smiled, a gentle, almost relieved smile. It was as if the weight of the years had finally lifted from both of them. There was no need for more words. Everything was already understood. Days turned into weeks, and Riva and Avon spent most of their time together, getting to know one another in ways they never had before. They talked, they laughed, they explored the depths of their feelings, and soon it was clear to both of them that their love was not just something fleeting, but something real. A few months later, under a sky full of stars, Avon proposed to Riva, his voice full of sincerity as he asked her to be his forever. Riva, with tears in her eyes, said yes. They married in a beautiful church,